So welcome to another episode of Planet Possible. We're delighted that you're joining us to hear evidence-led discussion about topics that are critical to the way we manage our water, nature and climate. A huge thanks to our sponsors, Decisio, Arup and MWH Treatment, and you'll hear a little bit more about them later. We're really grateful for their support in bringing Planet Possible to you. And if you're new to the podcast, I'm Niki Roach. I'm an enthusiastic connector of people and ideas and a fellow of CIWEM, which is the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management. If you have the pleasure of travelling across the British Isles, especially by train, like I did this morning, gaze out of the window and you will see a landscape that's hugely varied. In a journey of just a few hours, you'll see rolling farmland filled with sheep or crops or sometimes a solar farm, post-industrial towns and suburbs, the odd wastewater treatment works, although that might just be me, and if you're lucky, you might even get a glimpse of the coast. It's a quintessentially British landscape, but everywhere you look, you can see our fingerprints. There are only a few precious places across these isles that we might consider wild. So what's the impact of our activity on the land and our coastline, on our biodiversity and on our climate? And what could an alternative look like? It's with this in mind that I am really looking forward to our conversation on rewilding in Britain today. And we're joined by two excellent guests who I'm sure will give us both the big picture and the practical work already happening along parts of our coastline. So I'm totally delighted to be joined by the CEO of Rewilding Britain, Rebecca Wrigley, and from the Sussex Kelp Recovery Project, George Short. So welcome, George and Rebecca, to Planet Possible. I'm really delighted to have you both with us.
We're both delighted to be here.
Thanks, Niki. Great to be here with you.
Rebecca, can we start with a reminder of what rewilding means and what it's trying to achieve?
Rewilding is the mass restoration of nature to the point where it can take care of itself, but also take care of us. So its focus is on restoring natural processes, putting back in those processes like predator-prey relationships and free-flowing rivers that create the sort of dynamism of nature that is something that we're used to seeing probably more through, our screens in a David Attenborough documentary than we are seeing in real life, because in Britain we have one of the most nature depleted countries on earth. Its focus is on restoring natural processes and also reinstating the missing species that are vital to sort of kickstart those natural processes. And what it is sort of rebuilding nature's incredible web of life and the resilience and diversity of that life. But it is also about people. So it's about helping and working with people to find ways to live and work alongside nature and to thrive with nature. It's about building nature-based economies, for instance. It can help diversify jobs and livelihoods. It's about reconnecting people to nature, and it's about rebuilding those living systems and what fundamentally we all depend on Earth.
And is it something that is widespread? I mean, Rewilding Britain, you are doing it across the country, I'd imagine, but is this a relatively new concept, something that's been around for a long time? Give us a bit of a sense of the background.
It's been happening since nature began, so it's not new in that sense. It's probably the last 20 or 30 years across Britain, but also globally. So there's a global Rewilding Alliance, there's a Rewilding Europe. So people, I think, are beginning to understand that conventional conservation has been brilliant in halting the ever-declining biodiversity that we have, but it's clearly not working in terms of restoring that nature, or not working to the extent that we need it to. So what's a bit different about rewilding is that focus not just on conserving or sustaining particular habitats or species, but sustaining the system as a whole and allowing that to sort of thrive and do what it does best. And that includes the things that, as I mentioned, all the sort of living systems and services that nature provides to us. So the clean water, the flood mitigation, the drought mitigation, carbon storage, our own health and well-being and our livelihoods. Our whole food system, for instance, grows out of nature. So it is fundamental to our lives. And so rewilding's focus is on restoring the way that whole system, rather than trying to manage pieces of land or sea for particular species or habitats.
We had Guy Thompson on the show recently talking about markets for things like nature, and he used a really interesting analogy. He sort of said, imagine nature is a bit like a supermarket, but there is no checkout. Nobody pays, we just take everything in one direction. I thought it was a really interesting way of thinking about the services that we just get for free without considering, really. George, let's come to you, because I know that you are doing this on a daily basis, right? This is the practical reality, this is your life. So tell us a little bit about the Sussex Kelp Project. What are you trying to do? How's it going?
Yeah, so the Sussex Kelp Recovery Project is the UK's largest marine Rewilding Project. So we're trying to apply all the things that Rebecca just described at a seascape scale. And the reason for that is in Sussex, as with a lot of areas of the UK's nearshore habitat, our marine environment is extremely degraded. So historically we had underwater forests, kelp forests, that carpeted the seabed and were dense off our coastline all the way from Bognor Regis and further west over to Chichester, all the way down to Brighton, for people that are familiar with that area of coast. They provided benefits like protection against coastal erosion. They're really biodiverse habitats, so they supported local sustainable fisheries, and they also act as a nursery habitat. So many marine species will spend their lives out in the open ocean and then come into kelp habitats to spawn, or the young will be raised there to take shelter and feed until they're large enough or mature enough to go out into the open ocean. So they have a really crucial role in the life cycle of many species. If that nursery habitat is taken away, obviously the benefits for those species and the wider ecosystem, as well as the benefits for sustainable fisheries, are also lost. So, this is a huge amount of diversity. One single kelp can support 80,000 individual organisms. So vastly different to anything that we see on land, even in the UK. So really, really diverse systems. In Sussex, these were lost in the late 90s due to a combination of climate-related heat waves, pollution events and water quality, and crucially, the impacts of bottom-towed fishing gear, so things like trawling. So by the time that this project was initiated, we had lost 96% of our underwater forests. So a really huge change. The project, through a combination of efforts, predominantly the Sussex Inshore Fisheries and Conservation Authority, and their efforts as the local fisheries managers, put in a 300 square kilometre ban on bottom-towed fishing in our nearshore area, one of the biggest of its type in the UK. So really, really pioneering work to protect manage not only a specific species of fish, as we tend to, but to look at the whole ecosystem and say, actually, what is supporting all of these species and all of the benefits we get. So in 2021, that was in place, and we now have had 5 years of protected seabed in Sussex. So the Sussex Kelp Recovery Project is doing a huge amount of work to engage our local communities so that this ecosystem is never out of sight and out of mind again, so that it doesn't become lost. There's a really beautiful quote from Sir David Attenborough that details how the Sussex communities took their ghost forests to heart and wanted to resurrect them. And we're really starting to see that people are really engaged, and they were really involved in having that protection implemented, and to this day help with a lot of the monitoring that we do. So a lot of our work now is documenting how the ecosystem is recovering, providing a blueprint for how marine systems can be rewilded and how this can be applied elsewhere, as well as looking at the further barriers. We've removed one threat here in Sussex, which is bottom-towed gear, but there are a multitude of impacts affecting our ocean. So a lot of our work is trying to evidence those other impacts and see how potentially we can mitigate them in future. So things like marine heat waves, sediment impacts, and also water quality, so pollution as well.
So in practice, have you left the ecosystem to recover by itself, or are you actively going out and planting? Give me a sense of what rewilding means, like on the ground. I absolutely appreciate the kind of engagement is key because it keeps it in people's minds. That sounds wonderful. But on a practical level, seabed, are you doing anything, or are we relying on nature to sort of heal itself? How does that work?
Yeah, so we're nature-led. So it's all about removing human pressures and letting nature lead in its own recovery. In this system, that's really important because if we were to go out and plant kelp, for example, there isn't that hard substrate for kelp to attach onto. So we need that natural successional process to take place. So we need mussel beds to recover as a first step to provide that hard substrate for then kelp to then come in and attach onto, then other species to occupy the kelp, and then we will hopefully and inevitably get the benefits from that. So there's kind of this natural succession process. So it's nature-led, very much so, and the idea of that is that we can create a robust and more resilient ecosystem at a seascape scale.
I was really interested in the carbon sequestration piece because I think that is something that's perhaps not that well understood. And actually kelp is really efficient, isn't it, at holding on to carbon, like much more efficient. We talk about tree planting on land all the time, but have I got that right? Because it strikes me that kelp is a much more efficient way of locking carbon up in our oceans than planting trees on land.
So it does capture a lot of carbon, and it grows really rapidly. So in that process, it captures a lot of carbon. In UK waters, that probably doesn't contribute to much long-term sequestration. So it's a little bit of a misnomer there of in other systems where we have deeper waters, things like the giant kelp systems off South Africa or California, there's quite well documented pathways that kelp captures carbon, and then when it inevitably breaks off as part of its life cycle, it moves off into the open ocean, drops all the way down to the seabed and is incorporated into the deep sea, and that's how the carbon is sequestered. Because we have such shallow seas around the UK, a lot of the kelp, when it's broken off, is then washed back up onto our shores. So it's probably not too much of a contributor, the kelp itself, but there's been some really important work over the last year or so by a combination of organisations led by the Wildlife Trust to map for the first time globally. Any country has mapped its blue carbon habitats. And so that resulted in a really interesting piece of information, which was that 98% of our blue carbon is stored in soft sediment, so in the seabed itself, rather than other big contributors that we think of, things like kelp, salt marsh, seagrass. The real winner actually is the soft sediment and the seabed. So by removing things like bottom-towed gear in areas, we are actually protecting that vital carbon store, which we know the carbon in that seabed can be released up to 10 years into the atmosphere after the trawling has happened. So just in this top 10 centimetres of sediment, we have 244 million tonnes of carbon, so a huge amount. So locally, the real win is the removal of trawling and the protection of the seabed sediments as opposed to carbon sequestration in kelp.
I'm so pleased that I was wrong, but I asked the question, because actually it's utterly fascinating that I guess by putting that protective layer back in, by putting the kelp in, you are also creating a bit more of a barrier for that seabed to be disturbed. Amazing. As a global consultancy with extensive technical and advisory expertise, Arup works across the entire water cycle with utilities, local and regional governments, commercial and domestic water users and partners. From designing and maintaining key water infrastructure services to advising on natural catchments and flood defences, Arup helps its clients consider long-term economic, environmental and social dimensions. Arup, like Planet Possible, is focused on making progress for our climate, water and nature. Planet Possible is supported by Decisio, BMA's AI-assisted infrastructure intelligence platform. Decisio enables connected infrastructure planning by bringing together engineering, spatial, environmental and infrastructure data to help organisations make better, faster and more connected decisions. How's it going? I mean, you said bottom trawling finished 2021, so we're 2026 now, 5 years in. What's recovery looking like from your perspective?
Yeah, so we're only 5 years, as you say, into a decades-long process. And we weren't anticipating to see too much recovery at this stage, but actually what we have seen has been pretty astounding for all of us. There isn't a roadmap to follow with this type of work, so it's all a bit of prediction, and expectation only takes you so far. But what we have seen is really big expanses of mussel beds recovering, and as I said, they're really important for the successional process and re-establishing of kelp. So that's been absolutely inspiring, and the times that I get away from my desk and into the water, seeing these multi-layered mussel beds forming little reefs covered in starfish coming in to feed is, well, it made me cry. So that's really important. We're also seeing black sea bream recovering, so they're an important commercial species locally for those sustainable inshore fishermen. They were also a target of the trawlers originally. And for those that aren't familiar, black sea bream come in and carve out a nest on the seabed for the females to come in and lay their eggs, and then he will fiercely defend those. Because of the chalky substrate locally, when those little nests are carved out, they look like little craters on the moon. So we call them lunar pads. And now when you're swimming over the seabed in nesting season for bream, it literally looks like you're swimming over the moon. Like, it's incredible. And our science programme has picked up increases in the black sea bream as well. So they're kind of the two species that we're seeing real strong impacts, as well as increases in sand eels and mackerel as well. There's been a real win as well in terms of local perceptions. So recent surveys show that 98% of people locally now support the continuation of that seabed protection. So we're in the early stages of recovery and rewilding, but some really big wins so far.
So Rebecca, George said there's no roadmap for this really, and you're working it out as you go. But if we scale that beyond Sussex, is there a sense of what really works for rewilding? How do you approach it? What's the kind of most effective way of making projects stick?
I mean, I think what's wonderful about rewilding is that we learn from nature. So nature doesn't have a roadmap in and of itself, and it's not got sort of fixed outcomes. And it's all about freeing up the way that the whole system works. We just often, right from our sort of education system and the way that we work, we tend to think in silos and how things are disconnected. And what nature is about is a whole system working in balance. And it's dynamic and ever-changing. And that's why you can't sort of fix the species that you want to have in this place forever, because things change, climate changes, or there's a weather event, or there's some sort of disturbance and new species. Some species are specialised in pioneer species in disturbed areas, like after a flood, for instance. And that's what's sort of so wonderful about nature. And we can learn from that in the way that we work, and learning along the way and being agile and adaptive. And we've got this amazing rewilding network that George and the Sussex Kelp Project are part of, that's now over 1,000 initiatives, over 260,000 hectares of land and over 500 square kilometres of sea. What that group is doing is inventing and learning and trying and practicing and sharing that knowledge. And so we're sort of building this ever-increasing body of knowledge and experience on what works and what doesn't. And that's a real wealth of knowledge, of expertise, but also now data to show what practices are working and what progress is happening and what the impacts of that are. And not just ecological impacts, but also social and economic impacts. So one of the things that we've learned is that job numbers actually increase after starting rewilding. There are more jobs associated with rewilding than some other land uses, for instance, which might not be what people expect. And often over 100%, and in some areas over 400% increase in full-time equivalent job numbers. So what's amazing about the Rewilding Network and projects like Sussex Kelp is that there are many, many pioneers, and that sort of group of pioneers is starting to build into a network and into a movement, and a movement that is creating real change.
I mean, George, from your perspective, if you went back 5 years and you could know then what you know now, is there anything you would be delighted to have heard, I guess, at the start of your journey?
I'd be delighted to know that the mussel beds are back, that the other barriers to recovery are still there, but not preventing completely any recovery. Because I think one thing that we've really learned from this project is that people don't want to hear about, and they just are overwhelmed, people don't have the capacity to hear more negative news. So to provide and to be able to show this example of hope has really given a lot of people, and we've had a lot of personal testimonies of people saying to us that this has changed a lot their mental health, to know that there is this possibility for nature to recover and to see that happening on their doorstep. The other thing that I would be delighted about is knowing how much the dial has shifted on bottom-toed gear removal in that conversation. There is now several consultations of removing bottom-toed fishing gear in other areas of the UK. Whether our efforts have contributed to that or provided an example of hope, I can't say, but it's really encouraging to see. In terms of what we would do differently, I think we would put much more energy into recording how the ecosystem is changing. We're doing as much of that as we can, but ultimately we're an NGO predominantly funding this work, so it's always limited. If I could go back in time, I would have asked my ancestors to record a lot more thoroughly so that we would be able to account for this issue of shifting baselines. But that's a constant challenge, particularly in any marine conservation work. So I think we probably knew that, but I would have liked to have magicked up some more funds to do a bit more.
I think many projects will feel similarly. Rebecca, you touched on something that I'm really interested in, which is, are there any trade-offs? You talked about, FTEs and jobs, and I could imagine that, not specifically thinking about the Kelp project, but actually particularly on land, and we ask a lot of our land, don't we, in the British Isles? We are a relatively small amount of space with quite a lot of people and a lot of competing priorities. So I can imagine in some respects there might be the perception of trade-offs, or there might be actual trade-offs. I'd love to know what some of those are that you are experiencing nationally and how you handle them, Rebecca.
Yeah, good question. I mean, I suppose I prefer to think of them as balances rather than trade-offs, because trade-offs almost implies this sort of binary nature. It's either this or that then almost inherently leads to polarisation, I think. It's either nature or food, or it's timber or food, or it's wild animals and conflict. And I think what we've got to do in the 21st century is have a better understanding of what we're asking of the land and sea and how we balance those competing demands. Yes, we need food, we need timber, but we also need a stable climate, as we're seeing so starkly in the last few weeks in relation to the sort of drought and wildfires, and then last winter with all the flooding. We need nature. As I said, it's the foundation of all our food systems. Our soil is a living system, not an inert substrate, and I think often we're treating it as such. I think it's all about how do we find the right balance. So areas, yes, that are rewilding and natural process led, but areas of the land and sea that focus on producing food, for instance. So areas like the Sussex Kelp Project, where we ban trawling and dredging, not least because that creates nurseries that then replenish the fisheries that happen around them. On land, we would like to see 30% of Britain rewilding, almost like classified as natural process-led land as a critical and important land use, and that's seen as equally productive as areas that produce food and timber, for instance, because we need that balance. We do need to make difficult decisions in some places, and we need to make choices about how we use the land and how we use our seas, but we need to do them within the context of what's happening to the world in the 21st century.
And I would assume that even on plots of land, it's not one or the other. So, there are parts of farmland that are not productive. So there are margins where you can do something useful. And so I guess there's an element of, that's where some of the nuance comes, doesn't it? Which is it's not either or, it can be both, even in the same space sometimes, just depending on how it's managed.
Yeah, absolutely. And we don't talk about rewilding on high-grade agricultural land, for instance. That's the places that we need to produce food. But there are other areas where there are other land uses that are marginal for food production, but are highly productive for nature and all the things that come with that. It's almost like with rewilding, you kind of buy one and get 5 or 6 free, because you're paying for one intervention, but you're getting nature and you're getting carbon sequestration and flood mitigation and human health and well-being and clean water and, all of those other things. So, in terms of policymakers, it's a really cost-effective choice to make, and something that should be seen as critical national infrastructure and invested in accordingly.
I'm stealing that with pride, Rebecca. We sometimes talk about multi-capital benefits, but buy one, get 5 free is a much more succinct way of summarising that. I'm stealing it with pride, and I'm going to use that in future. That's a brilliant expression. You're absolutely right. There are so many benefits. I think it comes back to that point I made earlier, though, which is that we've been checking out of the supermarket without paying for a long time, haven't we? So it's making sure we value the 5 that we get free, actually. Yeah, fascinating. So we've talked a little bit about what's happening and some of the challenge. What's next? Give me a sense, maybe George at project level, and then Rebecca, I'll come to you nationally. What are you hoping for in Sussex? And what's the next 5 years going to look like for you?
So I think initially we would like to get a lot more evidence and get people locally involved in collecting that evidence. Those people that are so passionate and enthused about water quality, the big sea swimming community, get them involved in helping us collect the evidence so that we can identify what other threats our ecosystem is facing and look to mitigate those at a policy level potentially in future. But right now we just don't understand even the threats and which parts of the succession or the rewilding process are impacted and where the barriers to recovery are. So we do know that sediment in our waters is a big problem in Sussex, and that really relates to a lot of what Rebecca has been saying about rewilding at land and sea, and actually the interconnection of those. A lot of the sediment issues in Sussex waters come from things like dredge disposal, but also the fact that we have intensive agriculture that's then putting a lot of sediment into our river systems that are really degraded and don't have those natural bends and riparian zones that would maybe scoop up some of that sediment naturally. So both the canalisation of our rivers and the intensive agriculture and rewilding those spaces as well, or making them more nature friendly as sustainable use areas, will also impact and improve the health of our coastal ecosystem as well. So I think, in summary, a lot more focus on other barriers, getting the local community more involved, and working a lot more at that land-sea interface and connecting up our understanding of this whole catchment and the whole ecosystem.
And it sounds like a call for citizen science swimmers in the Sussex region, doesn't it? So I think it's get in touch with George and the team if that's something you want to do more of. You're absolutely right. You touched on earlier on, Rebecca, everything being connected, which is something that we talk about a lot here on Planet Possible. But I hadn't appreciated the sediment. We talk about water quality. I think about water quality quite a lot between rivers and the sea, but actually I hadn't even thought about sediment, which is really, really fascinating, and the impact of that going into the water. MWH Treatment is one of the UK's leading water and wastewater process contractors. MWH offers a truly integrated design and build service that's uniquely dedicated to the water industry. With an innovative and future-facing approach, everything MWH does is guided by its purpose to shape a better world. Rebecca, from a national scale, where would you hope Rewilding Britain is taking us in 5 years' time, say?
We sort of look at it at three levels. At the rewilding in practice level, we'd like to see and support growing movement or network of initiatives around the country that are supported to rewild and are sharing their learning. Where there's an area where there are a lot of rewilding initiatives, or where rewilding really is potentially highly productive use of the land, some of our national parks, for instance, we'd like to see larger areas starting to form partnerships. There's some wonderful ones across Britain, like Herbeck Heaths, for instance, and the Cairngorms Connect in Scotland, where we have larger landscapes that are rewilding. At the practice level, we'd like to see that. At the policy level, we'd like to see government support or recognise rewilding and natural process-led land and seas as a really critical use of our natural resources. We'd like them to rewild 30% and enshrine that in sort of policy. What we're working on is developing investment frameworks that work for the way that nature works rather than tries to fit nature into the way that finance works, for instance, so that we can get that larger scale investment, public funding, philanthropic funding into larger scale shifts in landscape and seascape. For instance, if you're a farmer or a fisher and you're seeing people are asking you to change, you want to get a picture of what that change might look like and what the business model in it is. Otherwise, you're going to be, of course, going to be reluctant to change. So we'd like to see that nature-based enterprise element and that economic diversification that can come alongside rewilding. And at the public level, we know that over 80% of people in Britain support or strongly support rewilding. So we'd like them to be able to get involved and sort of shift that public narrative, but also give people a way to take action in support of rewilding.
And I loved your point, George, around the mental health benefits of knowing that change is possible. And I think, Rebecca, what you've just said there, that final point around how do you connect with communities to say, yes, we might be able to do stuff in the Cairngorms or, like big landscape scale, but also what can we do in our own communal spaces and our own back gardens. I put a rain garden in my driveway recently, and the amount of interest it has generated is ridiculous. But it's a tiny thing, but it looks a bit different and people have been fascinated. And then I've got all sorts of little bits of wildlife on it now that I wasn't expecting. So sometimes it's even that kind of pocket park, little small personal stuff, isn't it, that cheers you up every day and makes you feel like you're doing something. Oh, I had a hedgehog in my garden the other day as well. I cannot tell you the joy that brought me. First hedgehog, I was very delighted. Okay, final question to you both, and I ask everybody this. We've touched on it a little bit, but I want you to get really, really specific with me now. I'm going to give you the Planet Possible magic wand. Treat it with some caution. It's pretty powerful. Give it a wave. You can make anything possible. George, what would you want?
I think this is possibly a slightly unusual answer to this question. I think people would expect me to say remove bottom-towed gear from our seas, and I think that would really help rewild our ecosystems and support those sustainable uses. But actually, I think I would increase our identity as an island nation. I think if you compare us to other islands around the world, the Faroe Islands, Hawaii, any of these archipelagos or individual islands, they have a really strong identity as an island nation, which we lack in the UK. And I think that comes in two directions. First of all, islanders are often quite outward looking because they're very aware of they depend on elsewhere and learnings or physical resources from elsewhere, which I think often in the UK we're a little bit insular in thinking about how things work only here. But from a conservation or a rewilding perspective, islanders are very connected with their ocean. They understand how it supports them, they understand the species that they have there. The ocean literacy is often higher, at least in the physical species and the fishing industry and that kind of connection. We have lost that in the UK as islanders. I think it will be really important to regain that. And along with it, an understanding of actually our survival depends on our ocean in terms of the oxygen that we breathe, the food that we need, our well-being, our climate regulation, as Rebecca said. All of these things are so essential to our individual, societal and species survival. So I think by increasing our identity as islanders, that would be a mechanism to increase our ocean literacy and understanding of our ocean, and hopefully lead to the protections that we need in terms of better fisheries regulation and reduction in forever chemicals and better water quality.
You're right. I was not expecting you to say that. What a very interesting provocation, really, that we don't think about ourselves enough as islanders in the British Isles. I love it. It's definitely one I'm going to be thinking about long after this conversation is finished. Thank you. Right, Rebecca, what about yourself?
Well, with my magic wand, I'd like everyone in Britain to be able to have access to awe-inspiring experiences of wilder nature. From our nurseries and schools to our care homes, people from urban areas, because it's like soul food, I suppose. And I am lucky enough to live in Devon, and on a particular headland off the coast of Devon, you can stand on the headland at a certain time of the year and watch bluefin tuna leap out of the water, close enough to feel the splash as they come down. And we go each year, and even talking about it is making the hairs stand up on the back of my neck. I'd love everyone to be able to experience that. And it doesn't have to be bluefin tuna off a rugged coast in Devon, but as you said, I also saw a hedgehog yesterday. I was out in the front garden. It's massive noise in the bushes. I thought there was a sort of bison in there, and out popped this little hedgehog. And it was like, just a sort of calming, just uplifting moment at the end of the day. So everyone should be able to experience that, not, as I said at the beginning, through a sort of TV screen, but on their doorstep, whether they live in a town or in the countryside or in a remote area.
I hope both of those very much come true. They are. You've given me some food for thought, and I'm sure for our listeners as well. Thank you. As ever, time flies by, and it's done it again. We're at the end of another episode of Planet Possible. So thank you for joining us. I hope you found the conversation you've heard insightful, and I really hope it's given you something to think about in your world. If you don't already, then you can subscribe to Planet Possible wherever you get your podcasts, and we will magically appear in your feed. And as you'd expect, we've got more fantastic guests and topics lined up for the rest of this year. So I really hope you'll join us for those. I'll pop links in the show notes to both Rewilding Britain and also to the Sussex Kelp Recovery Project that George and Rebecca have talked about if you want to find out more. And all that leaves me to say is a huge thank you to our sponsors, Decisio, Arup and MWH Treatment, and my wonderful guests, Rebecca Wrigley and George Short. So thank you both for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it, everyone. Stay curious, look for connections, and imagine what's possible.